Our last talk of this session is from Ben Baker, postdoc working with Conrad Courting at the University of Pennsylvania. When I asked Ben if there was anything he wanted me to mention, he said that he's a dancer and is interested in applying neuroscience tools to the study of dance. Today, he is going to give a talk about philosophy, though titled Neuroscience Needs Philosophy to Understand Representations. So thanks, Ben. You can take it away.
Thank you. All right, I will share my screen here. Let's see if this works. All right. So yeah, I slightly rejiggering of the title to make it a little bit less polemical here. I'm acting in my role as philosopher critic of neuro, but I guess keep in mind that I'm an aspiring neuroscientist myself, and I take you all to be philosophers yourselves as well. So yeah, and thanks again to another collaborator in the Courting Lab, Ben Lansdale, who I'm working on this paper with, and Conrad, and my PhD supervisors. I just finished my PhD in philosophy, so they had a lot of influence on my views here. So just to set the stage a little bit, the point of this presentation is supposed to address what I take to be some messy semantics in neuroscience, basically a lack of kind of a clear theory governing the use of certain key terms. So I have here, maybe I can use my, laser pointer. So yeah, information, code, computation, representation. I'm especially going to be concerned with representation. You don't have to take my word for it on the messy semantics. I'm just going to hide behind Conrad and Brett, who kind of make a similar claim about we need to clean up these terms. So just a first pass, very broad look at how philosophers have thought about representation and representationalism. There's lots of disagreement, but what can encompass most of philosophers who talk about this is understanding representation as something that's defined to have intentional content. This is often glossed as aboutness or directedness. Representations come in different types or modes. And these often highlight these features of representation. So for instance, a map of pen represents pen as something to be navigated. So this is kind of a mode of representation, a map-like mode, you could say. Pen is the object that you're trying to represent. And then similarly for a painting of pen represents it differently, an utterance of pen represents it differently. Okay, and so the broad view that in some sense, mind and mental processes are to be understood in terms of representation, I'm going to call representationalism, goes way back. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an overview. First, just to characterize the puzzle that's associated with this set of family of theories, we want to know what determines the content of a representation. If we say some mental process involves representing pen, what determines that it represents pen per se? This can be easier for other kinds of representations like language. We can rely on conventions. For art, maybe we can rely on the intentions of the artist or the consumers. But here we're trying to explain cognition itself. So what sets the content for cognitive or subcognitive states? Some closely related problem is the possibility of error. Essentially, if you're trying to determine the content, you're trying to determine when the content is right and when the content is wrong. In that states like beliefs, perceptions, plans, states that we think of as intentional states in philosophy, they can be false, they can be inaccurate, they can err. Representations more generally are like this. That's thus the explanatory value of appealing to representations is the sort of basic motivation. So just some quick historical highlights of representationalism showing up in philosophy. We have Aristotle. I mentioned de anima. It was fresh on my mind. That's why I had that response to Christoph. So neat about Aristotle that is he has a pretty explicit example to point out what we would call an isomorphism. So the way the wax receives the form of a signet ring pressed into it is the way that the organ receives the form. That is, there are sensible forms out there in the world for Aristotle. They impinge upon the organs in this isomorphic way, and that's essential to his view of perception. Samkhya Yoga, I just want to note, is interesting because it's a physicalist approach to mind. So that is, it's got these three components that we can go into later if we want: manas, ahamkara, and buddhi. And they're all constituted by different kinds of vrittis, i.e. changes in prakriti, which is the material side of a material-immaterial distinction in Samkhya Yoga. Moving on to the medieval period, we have Avicenna and Averroes, two really influential philosophers from that period, influenced a lot of the early modern West. Notably, the Latin intentio is taken to be a translation from this Arabic term mana, which figures centrally in their theories. And They offer an immaterialist picture where you've got almost a grammar of mana states that relate in some way that they try to explain to a material outer world. Going forward to the early modern West, you have more precise versions of a similar idea, especially Descartes, who had very precise kind of anatomical diagrams of the eye and the optic system, and offered theories about these mediating states between the material world and what is ultimately a immaterial internal kind of power of reason. But we've got a lot of this kind of isomorphism within mechanisms in the nervous system for Descartes. And he has this analogy of wind through the pipes that mediate between an organist's fingers and the sound. Quick, just make sure we're on the right page here, restate some basic points. We can sideline the overall metaphysical pictures that these different representationalist views fit into. Aristotle has this soul body composite view. Samkhya, as I mentioned, is a physicalist view. The Arabic and European views are non-physicalist views of mind. What these all have in common is this idea of states that are directed at or about things. And in some sense, those are going to be used to explain things like seeing something that isn't there or having a misperception. And overall point here is that it's going to take more than measured correlations between neural activity and more than information per se to determine representation in this philosophical sense of representation. So as versions of representationalism today in philosophy generally appeal to some notion of function. And I'll highlight the main one, but there's a couple of versions of this. Just to get the intuition going, the thought is the heart has a function to circulate blood and it malfunctions when it fails to do this. So you've got this distinction between the proper case and the inappropriate case. And if we, along similar lines, analyze neuronal activity as having a particular function, let's say to carry information about some stimulus, call that a representation, then we can derive from a notion of malfunction cases of misrepresentation. This is importantly going to rule out a lot of things that activity carries information about. Not all of that information content is representational content, would be one way to put it, in the same way that not all of the causal properties of a heart are its proper function. Just highlighting the first of these, so there's some disagreement about what sort of function you could use to specify representation. One prominent is teleological views. So here we have the telos from ancient Greek, actually, meaning purpose or goal. Here's some citations for this view, but essentially what you're trying to answer is what a component is supposed to do. Like, let's say some population of neurons that can fire at rate n or rate m. You're saying it's supposed to fire at one of those, and you're going to appeal to evolution or learning or some goal-oriented structure in order to specify how to decompose functions. And then here's some other approaches we can talk about if we want. Within teleological views, there are two main approaches: a backwards-looking ideological theory, what is the history of some part that has a function. We're going to answer what is that thing's function by appeal to what it was selected for, in a notion of selection that means natural selection over evolution, or we have a nice paper by Garson recently talking about selection in terms of the retention of synapses in populations of neurons. So selection at the scale of an individual learner. There are some challenges for this approach. We can talk about those. The alternative forward-looking a teleological notion of function relies basically on a non-reductive characterization of goal-oriented systems to start, something that you know when you see it. People will disagree about the hard boundary cases. You can formalize what it is to be a goal-oriented system in dynamical systems terms. People have tried to do that. Of course, there's disagreement about whether it can handle all kinds of these hard cases. But anyway, both of these give you the payoff, which is that you can use this philosophical framework about function to get functions to carry information or functions to represent, in short, and thus relying on this function malfunction distinction to actually have a view of misrepresentation, which is philosophers have thought is really important to a view of representation. If you can't explain misrepresentation, then something is missing. And then in future work, we want to kind of nail this down by giving a teleological interpretation of some recent research that uses whole brain recordings in C. elegans and also apply it to the deep neural net framework of modeling intelligent behavior, which very explicitly relies on learning goals and tries to focus less on representations. So that's another thing we're thinking about. So yeah, with that, I guess I will open it up for questions.
Great. That was a great talk. We've got 2 questions that I want to get to. Actually, a few more coming in. So Richard
Can
Lang.
I stop sharing? How do I do that? There, I got it. Sorry.
You got it. Okay, I'll read the questions anyway because we want them on the recording. So Richard Lang has asked, what is the link between intentionality as aboutness and being as for something? Can a representation about X be without, can a representation be about X without being for a particular action?
So on the teleological approaches to function, no. It doesn't have to be for carrying information about X per se, although I think that's the most popular way to gloss this in philosophy. But my understanding is that a representation, that's kind of what we're looking for, is suppose we think intuitively that this state in the brain is a representation of X because we found some correlation. Needing some more theoretical background to say what makes the content X rather than any number of other things it's also correlated with, you can appeal to ? I'm inserting here the teleological approach. So appeal to some notion of goal-orientedness or selection. The alternative notions of function that I didn't really get into, maybe I'll just do this quickly. Are we on time? Okay, we're okay. Well, actually, no, let me not do that. Sorry. The alternative notion of function, the main alternative notion of function in philosophy that's popular right now is, people are called the new mechanists. It's a mechanistic approach to function where the interest of the investigator sets what we take to be a mechanism that we're interested in. So you might be interested, for instance, in the heart as a mechanism for producing a sound. Forget the fact that it circulates blood. We're just interested in its capacity to produce a certain sound, in which case you can decompose it into parts insofar as they contribute to that sound making. And so in that case, you're still going to have a for, but that is, the part is still going to be for something related to sound making, but that is set by us as investigators rather than by some notion of the goal-orientedness of the organism or what it's learning towards or how it's been selected. Yeah.
Cool. We've got another question here that's gotten a few upvotes from Sander Van Bray. Mm-hmm. If all these philosophical accounts have in common is that representations are about something, and that's essentially how neuroscience uses it, neural activity X is about Y, is there really an issue?
So the issue as I see it is understanding what makes X about Y. So neuroscientists might disagree. They might offer alternative models about, that part X that's carrying information about Y, and it's actually carrying even more information about Z, but we think Y is functionally relevant and Z isn't. And so we hypothesize that it's about Y. Just because we think so, great. I mean, fine, you can operate on the basis of reasonable, educated guesses, but if you want a more fleshed out theoretical framework, teleological notion of function is supposed to do that for you.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I've seen some interesting data recently about how motion information is available throughout the visual system. And yet we have specific areas that we think are functionally relevant for motion. So how do you say that although there's information there, what are these regions actually for? So I think that's posing the problem really well. We have time for one more. We have time for one more quick answer. Ava is asking, could you go further into the application in deep neural networks?
Sure, I'll try to do this quickly. I'm thinking of a couple papers, one by Richards et al. Blake Richards, that says our framework should operate, rather than focusing on representations, we should focus on learning goals, learning architecture, I'm actually going to forget the third one, but what's important is that learning goals are a part of the framework, and that's kind of the locus of this teleological theory. So that's kind of a point at which you could say, okay, does the investigator just get to say what the learning goal of a system is, or do we need some more systematic way of saying what kinds of artificial systems, actual systems are goal-oriented? And if so, what determines the goal such that we can then look into the components and say, okay, because the goal is self-maintenance and getting food, then we can interpret this as a food detector. If instead we don't think that's what the artificial network is doing, that it's learning on something else, then that's going to change our representational hypotheses. So we're keeping representation in the picture, but making it derivative on this kind of goal-oriented structure that I think is sympathetic with the DNN-based approach.
Cool. So we had another question come in from